How would you define the word love? I took 1 minute and tried to come up with as many words as I could that were similar to or identical to the word love, and this is what I came up with. I'm sure you're probably thinking of others as you look at that list. But the Greeks had at least 4 words for love. They were eros, agape, philia, and storge. And we don't have all those words for love. So when I say that I love my kids and I say that I love pizza, I use the same word for love, but those are 2 really very different concepts. And so if you're wondering what all this has to do with Sunday school, remember that what we call the New Testament today was actually written in Greek, and what we call the Old Testament was written in ancient Hebrew.
Right. So if you're reading the Bible in English, you're not reading the original text. You're reading a translation of the original text, and there are lots of those out there. So how do you know which one to use? I'll tell you, you use the King James Version, obviously, that's what I use. But if you're really modern, you see you can use the New King James Version. It's one of the oldest translations into English, and it's really close to the original text.
But hold on just a minute, because I don't feel that way.
Okay, all right, you're wrong, but okay.
Maybe. I use the New American Standard Bible, but I chose my Bible based less on the type of translation and more really on the type of footnotes that it had, because it's a life application Bible and it's got historical context in the footnotes, and it's got like translation. If it's like a complicated word or like a word like love that has multiple meanings, it might give me those multiple meanings in my footnotes. And so I like that.
Mine is a King James, and it has footnotes too. Some are historical, some offer the editor's interpretation of a particular verse and what it means or how the church has historically understood that verse.
Right, so which of us has the better Bible?
Well, I still think I do, really, but I think the key is to pay attention. Look to see what version you're reading and do a little research. Is this translation you're using considered accurate? Are you reading a true translation or a paraphrase? A translation would be a word for word or line by line change from one language to another. The translator or translators would have to know both languages very well to do it, and that's frankly what I prefer. Paraphrase does not attempt to do that word for word translation. It tries to get at the idea of the text and put it into the paraphraser's own words. Eugene Peterson, for example, did that when he wrote The Message. Personally, I feel like that gets too far away from the original, and that can be dangerous. Peterson may be a talented writer, but he's not God.
Well, that's true, but I love using a paraphrase like The Message, because to me it presents the lessons of the Bible in ways that feel really unique and fresh to me, and I like that. But I do think you should be aware that that's what you're reading. So if there's a particular word or a verse that you find powerful or a story that you think is confusing, it's smart to cross-reference with a different translation, with an additional one, maybe a more traditional one, that would kind of go back more to the original language. And so to me, I think of The Message as being kind of like a starter Bible. Like, I get the basic idea, but if I really want to go deep into something, I'm gonna go to a different translation to check it.
Okay, well let's talk about how all these translations play out in the real world. I'm going to take John 10:6 as an example. It's an example verse to show how different translations interpret that text. Let's start with the New American Standard Bible. This figure of speech Jesus spoke to them, but they did not understand what those things were which he had been saying to them. All right, so we go to The Message, the paraphrase. Jesus told this simple story, but they had no idea what he was talking about. King James, this is
what he considers the gold standard.
This parable spake Jesus unto them, but they understood not what things they were which he spake unto them.
And who doesn't use the word spake?
I use the words. All right. So going back to this verse, looking at those 3 versions, and there are of course a lot more versions that we could have chosen from, but they all say the same thing in different words. The Message calls it a simple story. The King James Version calls it a parable, which is more accurate, but might be harder for someone to understand. So if you really want to do a deep dive into the verse, you'd probably want to look at several translations of it and maybe even see if you could find some footnotes on it.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good point. But, I also want to point out that verse that you just told us talks about how Jesus used parables, and specifically, he was talking about a parable that involved a shepherd. Now, of course, a parable is a story that Jesus used a lot of times to make a point, and so he would use it kind of like an analogy, allegory type thing. So the story that he had just told had to do with the good shepherd. Now, his listeners didn't understand his point.
Well, that happened a lot with his listeners, even even the disciples from time to time.
That's true. And they can be hard for us to understand too, because like the things that I know about sheep could really fit into a thimble. Like I went to the MSU South Farm, I have seen a sheep being shorn, and that's pretty much it, all I know about sheep. So when Jesus tells us a parable, or when I read a parable, that Jesus is talking about shepherds and sheep, I don't really know that much. So maybe a paraphrase or a retelling of the story that used, that compared God to a mother or something like that I am more familiar with is helpful to me,
Yeah, and using more than one translation and looking at footnotes can help kind of fill in the blanks for things we don't already understand, because we don't farm or tend sheep or live in the culture in which the Bible was written. At the end of the day, all we can do is pray over and research our understanding of the Bible and what is written in it, and our understanding will never be perfect. But we can understand better by making sure we are aware of what we are reading and knowing how to look up more information when we need to.